one of those things was this highlighted section which asked me if I wanted music to play while I approached the stage. And I've never actually had this request before. So I didn't really know quite what to think. And so I did what I naturally would do and asked Twitter. That was a poor idea. So of that, I received 152 musical selections back. 2,559 people then voted on those selections via likes and comments and stuff like that. Of which 51,406 of them were winners. That'd be the entire Twitter following, and I would be the one sexy loser because the music selection they chose was Right Said Fred, I'm Too Sexy. Thankfully, you didn't get to that portion of the lyrics. You probably didn't necessarily hear that, but it's all right. I did my job. I fulfilled my commitment to everyone on Twitter. So a bit about me, a bit about the site in case you don't know who I am or what I do. DCRainmaker.com started as a bit of a personal blog about 2008, 11 years ago now. So it just kind of like most personal blogs, I wrote about what I rode or ran or whatever that weekend, kind of a basic sort of thing. And then eventually it became a bit of a site for sports technology reviews. So I did a review on a Polar watch, then a Garmin watch, and before I knew it, I was writing on all sorts of wearables and everything from cycling stuff to running to swimming, kind of the triathlete realm in general, but even beyond that into wellness and health and all those different areas. But it's still a bit about me too. I still write about what I did this past weekend, and I think that's what people find interesting about it. And within that, I get about 4 million people a month that swing by to read about whatever the heck I've done that month or that weekend or that day. One of the things I want to mention up front, because it's kind of play into what you hear as I talk about it over the next half an hour, is the revenue for the site. And the reason why I mention this is because I review a lot of products, but I don't take any money from the companies I review. So I don't take advertising money from any of the companies I review. In fact, I actually block it entirely. So unlike a typical publication that may be taking that money from that same company they're reviewing, I don't do that. Which I mention that because in most of my speeches and stuff like that, I don't really hold back too much. I just sort of say it like it is. So I appreciate that I'm here with Firstbeat, but if I have something critical to say about that, you're going to probably hear about it. And that's true of any company I go and present at. And so I'm not like making you brace for anything coming momentarily, but just giving you the heads up. That's sort of the way I am, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Okay, so what is a wearable? Now, a lot of people put their hands up and talked about, how often they might change their wearables. And I was waiting for that, like this morning, with where you came from, to get down from 6 months to 6 weeks to 6 days to 6 hours, so I could finally put my hand up. I'm always trying new wearables out. I've got 2 on right now, which is actually pretty low for me. A typical bike ride will have me have between 5 and 10 devices on there that I'm evaluating at once. That's like a normal ride, but it could be way more than that. A run, like in this case here, these are my running shoes. There's actually 6 sensors on those shoes. You only see 4 of them. On the insoles are also sensors as well. And that's in addition to the watches and the heart rate straps that I wear. So like, again, a normal run could be a lot of different things. But wearables there are a lot of different ways you can attach them to your person. You have wrist-based devices, of course, that you're most familiar with, which are activity trackers or watches is the most common. Even sorts of sensor bands that have been out there. And then we get into upper arm devices, which can then still be sensor bands or muscle oxygen sensors. And that's before we talk about like the custom stuff that you see that some of you in this room are probably building that are entire textile-based or shirts and stuff like that have sensors all over the place. There's, of course, chest sensors, which are most common for heart rate straps, but then you get into, again, wearable devices that are actually shirts and stuff like that built into them. Sports bras having sensors built to them is becoming more and more common. And then motion capture systems on your chest as well, which, of course, a lot of professional teams are using. And then you get to lower body devices, which, again, goes back into motion capture stuff, primarily on the feet, but also like this year at CES, I saw underwear that have sensors on them. So, and the purpose actually was pretty interesting there. It was to go ahead and capture the same stuff that you're capturing on a watch, but just on your underwear. And the idea there is that you didn't necessarily have to always be wearing a watch. So people don't necessarily like to wear a watch to bed. They could wear this instead. They have, it's an interesting concept. Their pricing model didn't quite, I don't think it's going to work, but longer term, the idea that you can have this thing you go through, you have like a set of these underwear of like 6 to 8 of them pairs, and then you just iterate through. Interesting concept. I don't think it's like the 2018 trends. Still, it's worthwhile talking about what's kind of the norms for 2018 before we talk about what's coming down the road in wearables. And I'm mostly going to focus wearables on the wrist side of things because I think that's something that resonates most with the vast majority of people. And I think you kind of want to look at this list and realize how far we've come so quickly. And you look at each one of these ideas and you say, activity tracking is now baseline. 4 or 5 years ago, you could buy a digital watch and not have activity tracking in it. Today, if you went to a Best Buy in the US or Fnac in France or any of these sort of stores out there, you can't buy a watch that doesn't have activity tracking. That's impossible. The same way you can't buy a watch that doesn't have sleep tracking in it that's connected to your phone. These are all baselines that weren't there just a few years ago. Optical heart rate, that is now baseline for any device that you're buying above $100 in this kind of wearable watches segment. Smartphone notifications, also considered baseline. Same with basic platform integration. I mean, a couple years ago, you used to have silos where every vendor had their own little platform, didn't work with every other vendor. Now, consumers expect that. If your platform doesn't work with MyFitnessPal or some other platform that they use, it's completely dead in the water to begin with, which is really, really cool because you're getting to the point where the consumer's data is first. And when the consumer's data comes first, they can start doing interesting things with it, as opposed to when it's locked in these silos, it's kind of hard to use, and it's hard for not just consumers, but also medical fields and sports scientists and other areas to make sense of data that is just too proprietary to do anything with. And then finally being able to export that data. And something that I think you're going to start to see accelerate with GDPR, those deadlines coming up later on this month, that will make so that data is more accessible and more portable between different fitness platforms, which historically in the past has still been kind of cumbersome. Like obviously there's partnerships when two companies talk to each other, but that doesn't help you when those two companies don't want to talk to each other. GDPR will actually be good for that. There's also some trends that we're seeing that are starting to develop in 2018 that'll continue over the rest of the year and then expand going forward. Number one is music is becoming a norm, basically a must-have for anything over $250, getting down to $200. Like the Fitbit Versa I have on my wrist right here, $200 wearable, has music. A year ago, that would have been more or less unheard of, with the exception of some like unknown Android Wear type devices that may have had at that price point that no one actually bought. But now you're talking mainstream devices that will sell millions of units at $200. Apple Watch Series 1 with the price adjustments are now on that same sort of level. Same thing goes for contactless payments. Now you're talking pretty much everything above $300, but definitely getting closer to $250 by the end of the year, probably $200. Again, Fitbit Versa, the contactless payment one is $220, I think, or $229, something like that. So getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And the reason why that matters to the fitness crowd, or to the non-fitness crowd, is that the more features you can put in this watch that convince people to wear these watches 24 hours a day are reasons why they will hopefully increase their activity, as we saw this morning, hopefully increase their health. If you can make this where their Starbucks card is on here, as Fitbit and others have done, that's a reason to wear this watch so you don't have to carry something else. And so you want to add those incentives into these devices to keep people attached to them, whether they're hardware incentives or software incentives. Now, interestingly, GPS is actually not necessarily given anymore at $200. Both of these watches, so this is the Suunto 3 Fitness, which I believe Marcus is going to talk about just after me, no GPS in this. And the Fitbit Versa, also no GPS, depending on phone-based GPSs. Now, I don't think that's a long-term trend. I think that's sort of like this stepping stone of sorts. The recovery metrics, those sort of things, the day-to-day, the health metrics that you're seeing, those modules are valuable to everyday consumers that may not be trying to run a marathon. They may just want to go ahead and have some sort of day-to-day data that's actually provable. We're also seeing this really interesting splitting of platforms. So in the past, you had, if you bought a device from Garmin, you had your Garmin data and it was the Garmin platform all the way through. But now you're getting to the point where, yes, you have these wearable operating systems, whether it be Apple with watchOS, Fitbit with FitOS, Garmin with Connect IQ, Samsung with Tizen, and so on, that you get to the point where they're building apps on top of these, and third parties are building apps on top of these. And it's especially true in the case of Apple, where you can have people that are using apps on top of Apple Watch that never interact with the base health features of the Apple Watch. Their runs, their rides, all that stuff is going to a third-party platform because they're recording that data in that third-party platform. So you're getting to this point, we've really split this in half. And Apple's really been sort of that catalyst there, which isn't to say that Apple has been the first wearable app device maker out there, far, far from it. But the point where the apps are vibrant enough and they're compelling enough that consumers are going ahead and using the watch purely for that app, as opposed to necessarily the native experience. And in the case of Apple, that's no more prevalent or no more obvious when you look at something like running, where the base Apple running experience is at best a little slim compared to some of the more endurance-focused watches out there. And that's where you see some of those trends develop. And you look at things like, why are companies making apps to begin with? And it used to be when apps were out there first for watches, it was all like beer and cupcake counters, right? It was just the basics, and you had some watch faces that were really, really simple as to how many beers you earned when you went out and ran. Nowadays, that's not the case. Nowadays, apps on these watches are really tied to business models or tied to business entities behind the scenes trying to do something interesting and trying to do something compelling to drive their product. And so if I look at a lot of the apps that are on the Garmin platform, for example, that are most successful from a device standpoint, these are apps that tie to secondary accessories and sensors off of that platform. And that's where you see them starting to develop a business model around something which is more sustainable than a beer counter. And again, that's what most of the apps that you see out there on the Apple Watch are doing, is they're tied to a app behind the scenes on the phone. And for a while, of course, Apple prioritized the App Store rankings based on whether or not you had a Apple Watch app on your device. And so that's why you saw this huge rush of Apple Watch apps out there, is because companies were trying to ensure that their phone app had higher rankings because they also had a companion Apple Watch app. And in fact, you'll see users are trying to work around this. So ironically, it was really funny actually, just like 15 minutes before the session, I met someone and I didn't expect to meet them here. My slides were already done. And the person I was gonna mention was Ian Blackburn. He's here in the front row right there. And he has a site called Apple Watch Triathlete. And this is really funny because if you have an Apple Watch, you know that the last thing that you would attempt to do with that is to race an Ironman with it. Full Ironman with a marathon on there, a really long day. Yet that's what he's done. He's wrote an entire site around using the Apple Watch with apps and with other platforms to attempt to race an Ironman with it, which is kind of thinking outside the box. So this is a case where someone is going ahead and trying to use a device that really wasn't designed for an Ironman race, but using all these third-party platforms to go ahead and move that forward. So consumers are basically saying, I want the watch that I want, and I'm going to make everything else work around it. Still, there are some legit issues in 2018 in terms of wearables. First of all, is the data is too confusing. And there's so much data being collected, but so little is being used. So I took this picture here of this Fitbit Versa watch just during lunch. This is of the sleep thing. In case you can't read that from there, it says, are you feeling well, rested, or a bit sleepy? Compare this to your sleep stats in the Fitbit app. Why is a Fitbit asking me that? And I'm not like gonna making fun of Fitbit here, because honestly, Garmin and others are just as bad. But really, why is it asking me that? It knows how well I'm rested. It knows that I slept 4 hours and 24 minutes last night. It knows that I went to the airport at 6 in the morning to catch a flight here, which is 5 in the morning your time. It knows on my schedule that I'm going back tonight at 7 p.m. and I'll finally get home between probably 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. Why is it asking if I'm well rested? Of course I'm not well rested. So at what point are wearables going to get to the point of looking at the data they already have and saying, oh, you have that 4 hours and 24 minutes. It was correct in Fitbit. I looked in the companion app, and yes, 4 hours and 24 minutes. I woke up at 1:30 and 2:30 and 5:30 because the baby screamed. Why are you asking me? And that's where we have, and that may sound like a silly example, but the user says the same thing. When I clicked on this little message there, what did it do? It said dismiss. That's it. So what it served no purpose. Why is it not saying to me, hey, you're tired, go for a walk? Or hey, you're tired, go take a sleep or nap or something. That's where devices have to get to. That's where wearables have to get to make it more compelling to users. Another challenge we've had in 2018 and really in 2017 as well is the challenge of bad studies. And I know there's some academic folks in the room here, and so this is my chance to chat about this. So one of the challenges that I see from my standpoint on studies that focus on wearables is how poorly they are done consistently over and over and over again. In particular, a lot of studies that will do wearables like this. If you see a picture in the mainstream media or any media that shows this here, that is a bad study. That is a study that has two watches side by side on two wrists. And the reason that's bad is a whole bunch of reasons. One, this impacts steps. So when you hold these watches like this, they bounce together, logically, and all these watches are accelerometer based. And when they do that, they count extra steps. And when you count extra steps, you get extra distance. Therefore, all your data on steps and distance are skewed. Also, when it comes to heart rate, when you do this, you constrict blood there, so the next one doesn't get the correct readings. Why does that matter? When you constrict blood, you reduce the heart rate readings on these, and when you reduce the heart rate readings, you reduce your calories. You also impact stress and all the other metrics you talk about for the end of the day. So when I see studies that look at some of these metrics and start to say, oh, they're all wrong, well, of course they're wrong. You wore these devices the wrong way. And then this particular study that I was looking at here went and doubled down on that. They actually had a pretty interesting methodology for going ahead and figuring out whether the optical heart rate sensor was accurate. They started off with sitting, then walking, then running, and cycling. Except they ran into an issue, that some of their devices didn't properly export data. So what was their solution to that? They said, no problem. We're going to forget 80% of the data. And we're only going to take the last 1 minute and extrapolate the heart rate readings out from there. So they took the last 1 minute of data, and I explained this all right here, and they said, that's the data for the rest of the data set. So I said 1 minute, the last 1 minute, the 5 minutes is considered the value of the entire 5 minutes. Well, that's useless because all the problems happen in the first 4 minutes of each set. So you just threw away all your valuable data. And this happens over and over and over again. Another case, the company went ahead and used private libraries to gather basically the calorie data, but they've used the wrong data field. So instead of using the data that the end user gets on the normal app with the normal experience, they tried to back end it, and they got the wrong data and didn't realize it, and published this big fancy study showing how all these wearables were wrong. Point here being that if you're making wearable studies, at least ask the companies that you're studying if you're doing it right. And that may sound obvious, that may sound trivial, but it's important because a lot of studies, I look at studies almost every week, and almost every one of them has pictures like the first one and is doing it wrong. And that's not really helping anyone, because if the point of your study is to show that wearable devices are good for users, then you need to go ahead and show that wearing them is also valuable for those users. I'm getting the watch look here. Okay, 3 minutes, yeah. So a couple things that we'll cruise through here. Fitness platform security. This is something that we're going to see a lot of companies struggle with this, especially once GDPR is in place going forward. There's been a lot of acquisitions in the fitness platform space over the last year. Under Armour being really the biggest one out there, acquiring pretty much everyone that was left. And as a result of that, mistakes have been made. Of course, there was a huge leak with 150 million accounts just a couple weeks ago, or a month ago now, by Under Armour. The whole controversy with Strava and whether or not Strava was at fault is entirely besides the point. They got embroiled in that, and I can only imagine there's going to be plenty more over the course of the year as companies realize that safeguarding all this data is just as complex as it is for Facebook for these smaller companies that are focused on fitness data. So let's talk going forward. A couple big things. One is that contactless payments are becoming the norm, as I mentioned earlier, and they're going to only become more of the norm over the rest of the year. But it's not just the watches that have to catch up, it's also the payment processing systems behind the scenes, the banks, all of that has to catch up. Optical heart rate will become $100 basis point by the end of the year. There's really no question about that. We're seeing that come down to like 130-ish right now, so $100 and beyond. I think we'll still see Wear OS, Android Wear struggle. It doesn't have that like beacon, that one device to look at and say this is the awesome device for Android Wear. Therefore, as a result, it's going to be tough, almost as tough as hitting the 1 minute left of my presentation. And then we're going to see kind of this rise and fall I mentioned of connected devices across the board, so GPS connected devices. Stopped mostly because Under Armour ran out of people to buy. So at this point, there's no one left for them to buy. And you're going to see this kind of cease. But coaching is the new thing to do. Like buying a fitness platform 2 years ago is the sexy thing. Now it is coaching. Everyone wants to have a coaching product. We've seen Fitbit do this where they want to have coaches, not just for like sports stuff, but your life, to be able to say, hey, you should be eating this and sleeping and doing this and all these things combined together and making that into the app. Similar to what I showed earlier about the sleep in the 4 hours and 24 minutes, but for the entire day and having that all be pulled together. We're seeing Exert in the endurance sports space do some really fascinating stuff here where they can monitor your ride in real time, all computer-based, and adjust and say, nope, you're not hitting a workout today, and cut it off in real time, as opposed to getting to the end of the workout and just saying, oh, that was probably too much, you're overloaded today. They're doing it in real time and adjusting as they go through, which is it's really, really fascinating stuff to see. And finally, the biggest opportunities. The biggest opportunities here are making data not just actionable, but immediate next steps. Too often companies will say, we have actionable things for something. You can go ahead and make this data actionable. But actionable still requires the end user to know what to do next. You want to get to the point where you make it obvious. You say, this is your one thing you should do next, and do it. Not just here's 5 things you could do, not here's your choices. Just give them one thing. In my case, go take a nap. In someone else's case, go for a 5K run. Whatever it may be, just give one thing that it should be doing and focusing on. And just keep in mind that the people that are running a Couch to 5K program are really no different than Olympians. They're both trying to get data out of these devices. In the case of Olympians, they're probably getting that data from a coach, but they're still getting the guidance. They're still getting that data somehow. In the case of a Couch to 5K, they're entirely reliant on this watch and the data that's coming from it, and the guidance coming from this watch and that app. And then last but not least, if you're in the hardware business or the software business or the platform business, just make cool shit. It appeals to everyone and it does the job, and if you make cool shit, then I promise you, everything else will fall in line. With that, thank you very much.